Why is communism a social relationship and not an ideology? The answer isn't actually that complicated. Just to be clear, Karl Marx wasn't the first person to use the word communism. The word itself comes from the Latin communis, which means of or for the community. Hunter-gatherer communities, indigenous or tribal civilizations, and even early Christians established societies in which connections, interactions, and participations between its members, or in other words, the social relationship of its members, were based on this idea of or for the community. The means and the tools to produce life, as well as nature, were not held in private and mediated through real or imagined notions of value. They were simply available to everyone to be used in common to ensure that each received what was needed. Far from being a conscious political or economic idea, it was simply a natural way for groups of people to interact with one another that ensured all needs were met and everyone had the best chance of survival. That's what communism is. Through his analysis of history, Marx pointed out that new modes of production determine new cultural and social norms. This meant as the hunter-gatherer and tribal modes of production gave way to conquest and new technologies, where animals were domesticated, new agricultural methods were developed, and new tools invented, this new mode of production gave rise to new cultural and social norms. Eventually, that primitive communist social relationship became increasingly difficult to maintain or entirely obsolete. When we arrived at the capitalist mode of production, that new social relation defined by its mediation or instrumentality of things, as Marx called it. Technology had advanced so much that Marx argued when capitalism's collapse came about, a return to that social relationship is not only possible, but it's the only way to ensure that the human species could realize its full potential in freedom. I would even go so far as to suggest it's the natural default social relation for the human species. Look at any relationship outside of a formal structure or authority, such as a friendship group, and you'll see communism at work. But Marx wasn't just a philosopher and a sociologist, he was also a political militant. He wanted to establish a political movement that not only fought for that social relationship, but was identifiable with it. He wanted a communist politics that could deal with the here and now, with life under capitalism, and that differentiated itself from other forms of socialism, which couldn't understand communism was not an intellectual pursuit, but the logical historical step arising from the capitalist mode of production. Marx said communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established or an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things.
Meanwhile, you've got this second, third generation of work shy, malingerer. You can call it what you want.
Work is immoral. Waged labour is immoral. It is the single greatest enemy of human progress. It renders people objects, it commodifies their existence, it steals their time, and it destroys their hopes, their potentials, and their connection to nature and to themselves. You are not wrong for hating work. You are not immoral for avoiding it. You are not insane for wanting to be rid of it. Shirking work, strategizing ways to avoid it, gaming the system, doing everything in your power to never have to earn a wage is the sanest response to a world that reduces your life to 8 hours, 8 hours, 8 hours. I'm nobody of particular significance, but I wanted to tell any person who hates their work, hates their job, hates their boss, hates their life, and struggles every day not to lose their mind over the prospect of 50 years of meaningless, monotonous labour, that I know you're not crazy. I know you're not lazy, I know you're not a malingerer, and I know you're not selfish, and I know you're not afraid of hard work. Your hatred and despair at this life of work is the response any animal trapped in a cage would make. I know that given the opportunity to do activity that had meaning to you, that had meaning to your life, that had meaning to your family, activity that meant your time was valued, that your friends and communities could access means of consumption directly, activity that could liberate your time to use in the pursuit of your dreams, your passions, and your interests, you would be the most active, ambitious, diligent, and selfless person. It's not you that's the problem. It's not being active that's the problem. It's the kind of activity this world demands of you. The problem is the world in which you live, the world that reduces you to nothing more than a machine, that demands you use your body and your time to provide wealth to another person that you will never get to experience, a world that expects you to give up rational, productive, enjoyable life for an existence of boredom, shame, degradation, and meaninglessness. These dinosaurs who tell you everyone must work, who patronize you, who make you feel guilty, who hound you for not being productive enough, they are the ones who have the most to lose. And that's why they use every tool available to them to make you believe that dragging yourself out of bed every morning to do a job you hate is the normal way to live. But it isn't normal. Work is immoral. Wage labour is immoral. Another world is possible. We have everything we need. We just have to take it. Don't ask for a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. Demand the abolition of work. As the French workers of 1968 said during their strike and their riots, under the paving stones are beaches.
Someone told me that communism is a classless, moneyless, stateless society. That's not true.
I have seen Marxist-Leninists make this deranged Lassallean nightmare argument before, and I think it comes from their reading of Stalin's ridiculous writings, a rejection of historical materialism in defence of a productivist conception of history, and their inability to conceptualise the depth of Marx's vision of communism as being anything other than another form of social democracy. The axiom that communism is a moneyless, stateless, classless society doesn't come from a direct quote from Marx. It's not that he's written this down somewhere, but if you read his writings and his speeches carefully, in which he critiques political economy, explains historical materialism, and he outlines his vision for communism, there can be no other conclusion that communism is a classless, stateless, moneyless society. If communism is about the liberation of the proletariat from exploitation, how do you imagine that exploitation functions if not through the social relationships of money, the state, and classes? What was the purpose of Marx's critique of political economy, his explanation of historical materialism, and his vision of communism, if not to uncover these social relationships as the things to be liberated from? In Critique of the Gotha Programme, Marx outlines a vision of communism in which commodity production and exchange no longer exists and use values are produced and distributed based on need. He explicitly says that since commodities are no longer being produced and exchanged, that value and the measure of value ceases to exist. Therefore, according to Marx's critique of political economy, by implication, if there is no value and no measurement of value, then the socially acceptable form that that measurement takes no longer has any meaning. It no longer has any function in society. That socially acceptable form of that measurement being money. He also discusses labour vouchers in the first phase of communism. So what purpose would labour vouchers have if money still existed? See Capital Volume 1 for Marx's monetary theory of value and a full explanation of his social analysis, in which he painstakingly outlines value as a social relationship and the social form that money takes in a capitalist society, and thereby its necessary disappearance through the abolition of commodity production and exchange. If you want a practical example, I'd refer you to the 1919 Lenin program of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, in which they outline measures to be taken during the revolutionary transformation to abolish money. On the state, Marx argued very clearly that a state is nothing more than one class organised to suppress another. He argued that in the course of class struggle, the dictatorship of the proletariat will emerge as the proletariat organised to suppress the bourgeoisie, i.e. a state, and that this state would exist until the economic conditions that give rise to class have been abolished or overcome or transformed. And once the economic conditions for class had been abolished, and therefore class has been abolished too, the state would cease to have any meaning or function, since a class that doesn't exist can't organise itself as such. I just want to read you some quotes from Karl Marx. This is the first one. What I did that was new was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. Two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Three, that the dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. Here's another quote. The proletariat is itself still a class, and the economic conditions from which the class struggle and the existence of classes derive have still not disappeared and must forcibly be either removed out of the way or transformed, this transformation being forcibly hastened. Here's another one. If by means of a revolution the proletariat makes itself the ruling class and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally. And one final one. Our concern cannot simply be to modify private property, but to abolish it, not to hush up class antagonisms, but to abolish classes, not to improve the existing society, but to found a new one.
Low-skilled job, and this whole rhetoric of having low-skilled jobs versus high-skilled jobs is just capitalist propaganda to justify paying poverty wages to working class people.
There are such things as low-skilled jobs, and denying this obscures the reality of the capitalist mode of production, and it's vital to have the correct analysis of capitalism's development if we are to fight capitalism. I'm going to explain why. The limit of the liberal analysis of capital put forward in that video ultimately concludes that everyone is skilled because it conceives of the differentiation as a moral question. Accordingly, if you say someone has an unskilled job, you judge their worth and value as a member of society. But this is nonsense. Acknowledging the existence of unskilled labour is not a moral judgment on the worth of someone. It's a recognition of how the capitalist mode of production has objectively developed to make surplus value extraction as efficient as possible. Unskilled labour does not describe someone's social worth. It describes the consequence of what Marx calls capital's real subsumption of the labour process, in which technology and machines transform the labour process. This means that workers no longer have to be trained or skilled in certain crafts or whatever, because technology and machines have reduced that training and skill to an automated function that requires the simple operation of a machine. And this is happening everywhere throughout the capitalist mode of production all over the world. This reduction of labour to simple operators or overseers of machines means that less of the working day is then required for the labour necessary to reproduce the worker, and more time can be devoted to surplus labour, the labour that produces surplus value. So in other words, if you de-skill people to simple machine operators or service workers, the worker can spend less time in the day producing their wage and more time in the day producing the surplus value that is taken as profit. And this is called relative surplus value. The relativity of relative surplus value being the surplus part of the social working day is surplus relative to a decreasing necessary part, meaning that capital can valorise itself based on a given length of a social working day. And you can read chapter 16 of Marx's Capital for a more thorough explanation. What this means is that capital's real subsumption of the labour process, the introduction and transformation of the labour process by machines and technology, the de-skilling of workers, also has the benefit of making workers more precarious. Because fewer workers are needed to operate machines or do service labour, the reserve army of labour increases, making it easier for capital to discipline workers. If there are more workers than the economy needs, it means it's easier to replace people, particularly because the work is unskilled and it means anyone can do it. And one of the most profound consequences causes of all of this is the loss of the worker identity that has typified previous cycles of struggle and the negation of traditional collective bargaining powers. If you're unable to recognise this reality and reduce labour or work to a moral question about self-worth, then you're unable to understand how capital exploits labour, and you do what the person in this video has done and reduce the question of the class struggle to that of a wage dispute, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. But the question of the class relation that faces a proletariat, whether skilled or unskilled, is not how do we achieve a better wage, how do we achieve that fair day's pay. It's how do we overcome the class relation itself, and how do we abolish the wages system altogether.
Workers own work. Communism is an economic system where employees own their workplace.
Karl Marx in 1865 gave a series of lectures to the International Working Men's Association, which have now become known as Value, Price and Profit, and in part of it he discusses working class and trade union struggles for increased pay and better conditions, and he says this: the working class ought not to exaggerate to themselves the ultimate working of these everyday struggles. They ought not to forget that they are fighting with effects but not with the causes of those effects, that they are retarding the downward movement but not changing its direction, that they are applying palliatives, not curing the malady. They ought therefore not to be exclusively absorbed in those unavoidable guerrilla fights incessantly springing up from the never-ceasing encroachment of capital or changes of the market. They ought to understand that with all the miseries it imposes upon them, the present system simultaneously engenders the material conditions and the social forms necessary for an economical reconstruction of society. Instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. This passage sums up the ground upon which communists must fight, particularly against social democrat opportunists like the man in that video, who, whether through some misplaced pedagogy, unintentional incompetence or outright malevolence, seeks to de-radicalise communism and relegate its status as the historical negation of the capitalist mode of production to nothing more than a Bernie Sanders campaign slogan. Because, as Marx makes clear, proletarian struggle against capitalism is not a reordering of the present conditions, where, for example, workplaces are democratically controlled, where the worker imposes wage restrictions on CEOs. Proletarian struggle against capitalism is the abolition of the conditions of its existence. Communism is the negation of work, the negation of workplaces, the negation of wage labour, the negation of commodity production and exchange, the negation of value, the negation of class by higher forms of activity and social relations in which we produce and reproduce ourselves in common with one another, where the separation between being alive and the things we need to stay alive, the separation between my activity and your activity, the separation between individuals is ended. Communism is the historical negation of capital, and in simple terms it is the production of a society in which life as the social activity of reproducing your existence is no different to getting up in the morning and making yourself breakfast. It is the liberation of humanity from the limits imposed by wage labour, by work and by workplaces. Now, I understand that for many people this vision of communism is impossible to imagine. Capitalist ideology and the realism it constructs limits our ranges of references and thought process, including our imagination. And this is, in part, the profundity of Marx's ability to consider the implications of his critique of political economy and to conceive an endpoint that is both realistic and possible. The adage, from each according to ability to each according to need, is not some incidental phrasemongering and shouldn't be relegated to the back end of a discussion as if it was just an afterthought. That sentence sums up the fundamental social process that underpins communism. You may not believe that this vision of communism is realistic or possible. The man in the video might not believe that it's realistic or possible. But the realisticness and possibility of communism is not contingent on whether people believe it's possible or realistic. Transformation occurs through class struggle, not through a battle between ideas. But to construct a vision of communism that is not only unable to conceive the vastness of its intentions, but tries to convince people that communism is in fact its exact opposite, that it's just the perpetuation of the conditions of capitalism, only with a different management structure, reinforces the liberal view that it isn't work or workplace itself that is alienating, but how the work and workplace is managed. And that is dangerous, deceitful, ahistorical, and serves only to reinforce the counter-revolutionary view that nothing can or will ever fundamentally change.
This is quite a common opinion that I encounter as a communist, and I want to explain why it's wrong. In a capitalist society, workers go out and they produce things, whether that's burgers, roads, bread, phones. When workers need to access those products, they can't do it directly. There's a barrier that the capitalist puts up between the worker and the products they create. That barrier is exchange and value. That means when you want to access those products, you have to use another commodity, money, which is a commodity, to access those products, which are commodities. Now, that need to use commodities to access those products of labor create the whole system of having to go to work to pay your rent, to earn money, because you can't access those products without money. In a communist society, communism removes that barrier so that people can access the products of their labor directly. There's no longer any need to exchange commodities to get other commodities, because the things that humans need are produced based on need. Everybody's labor is directly and freely accessible to everybody. That social relationship makes wanting more irrelevant. It makes it irrelevant because even if you wanted more, and even if you took more, what would you do with it? You see, everybody can access everything they need. Taking more than you need would only make sense if you can exchange that surplus of products for other things. In a communist society, there's nothing to exchange your surplus of products for. Why? Because everybody can already access everything they need. Whereas in capitalism, accumulating surplus products means that you can then exchange those products for money, because people can't access those products without exchanging money for that surplus. All that would happen if you took more than you needed would be that you just had loads of stuff in your house. And that seems pretty pointless to me. The thing is that we have to imagine a world that is fundamentally different to the one that we live in now. If humans want to continue living on this planet, we're going to have to find sustainable ways to produce things. And currently, it's absolutely not sustainable. This will mean, as we transition into a new society, that the vast majority of things that are produced will simply not be produced anymore. There won't be 1,000 different types of toothpaste and 1,000 different types of toothbrushes. Capitalism overproduces these things because it's based on competition, and that won't exist anymore. So when you realize that production will actually be vastly reduced, this issue of scale becomes less of a problem. That, coupled with the fact that producing energy and producing food will needs to become regionalized and localized, the mass production of food will also be massively reduced. But you're right, even on these smaller scales, we will need a way to know what it is that people need. One example that I've heard, I can't remember where I heard it, was that areas would have central distribution centers. These central distribution centers would then be in communication with places that produce and distribute things. So as it works now, when you need something, you go online,
You go onto your distribution center, you click on that, and you say, well, I need this, and I need this, and I need this. That information is then fed to your distribution center, which then collates that information and sends it to the centers of production. Then when the things are produced, the distribution center gets the things delivered to them, and on the system goes. I think the point that we have to remember, though, is that the way that we organize things is something that we decide together. I can't decide how a communist society is going to organize things. We just have to know that whatever the system is, we can make that work together. Humans create the world that we live in. We're not slaves to abstract concepts and ideas. If we need to make something work, we can do that. But if you're unconvinced by what I'm saying, just remember this: capitalism is unsustainable. At some point, it's going to collapse. So if it's not communism, then it's going to have to be something else, and it's going to have the same problems. Providing everything that people need and being able to access the products of people's labor based on need does not prevent people from being able to create things that they might want or they might want to share with other people. Communism isn't about stopping people from being creative or not providing the means to be creative. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about creating a society in which labor is reduced to such a level that everyone can get what they need, and for the rest of the time, people can follow their passions and create the things they want to create. So if you want to be a musician, go and be a musician. But what you can't do is compel other people to do labor that they don't want to do. So if you want to build a Rolls Royce or another luxury item, then build it. Find other people who want to build them. What you can't do is create a system in which individuals are compelled to do those jobs, even if they don't want to, just so they can eat. For the first 100,000 years of human history, people lived communally and collectively. The idea that those people didn't innovate is just clearly ridiculous. If that were true, then the human species would never have survived. Money is an incentive in capitalist society, but that's only because there's no other kind of incentive. In a communist society, the incentive comes from those people who want to do things. And communism is about providing the space and the means for people to do the things that they actually want to do. So if you want to design a beautiful luxury pair of loafers, if you want to build a music studio and produce amazing classical music using a cello, if you want to write a book, if you want to build a luxury car that goes really fast, do it. Find other people who want to do it and be happy. Normally, I just tend to ignore this ridiculous kind of white noise nonsense that people say because it's not interesting or useful. It doesn't contribute anything to the discussion, and it's usually just a reflection of the individual saying it more than it is about the ideas they're engaging with. But I think the psychology of people who say things like this is really interesting. I think, first of all, it's a consequence of capitalist ideology. But it also tells us a lot about how people see themselves in the world that they live in. What does success even mean? And what does it look like? Because to me, success is relative to the individual. Somebody who aspires to be the richest person in the world will not feel successful until they've accomplished that, right? Somebody, an actor who wants to win an Academy Award, won't feel successful until they've achieved that. But then you have people who live pious lives, people like Franciscan friars who live in friaries together, dedicating their lives to God because they want to serve God and they want to serve the poor. And they do that their entire lives. Is that not success? Obviously, what this guy means is that unless we are like him, we can't be successful. But I think really believing that somebody who wants to live in a world where people aren't destitute and starving to death is somehow a reflection of their jealousy and a character flaw is a really tragic way to think. For me personally, as a communist, success will look like a world in which people aren't destitute and aren't starving to death. And I won't feel successful until that's been achieved. And I guess that's why I dedicate my life to trying to achieve it. But on a personal note to this guy, I hope that you find whatever success you're looking for. But I hope that in the course of finding that success, you also find a little humility and compassion. So I've seen quite a fair few comments like this, and I thought I would address it. So in a capitalist society, there's a relation of production that's called the division of labor. In a capitalist society, humans are compelled to work. It doesn't matter what that work is, just so long as they have work. Because if they don't have work, they can't get money, and without money, they can't access the products they need to not die in the streets of starvation. So some people specialize, they become doctors, some people become farmers, some people become janitors. People stay in those jobs because it's necessary for them to do so, because it earns them money. Everyone needs a job, right? In a communist society, that compulsion no longer exists. People don't need to get a job to survive because they can access products directly. What is required, though, is for people to do socially necessary labor. But because in a communist society, production is generalized and regulated based on need, it means that people won't have to do the same job all the time. It may be that 1 week you need to work in a bread factory, another week you need to be a road cleaner, and another week you need to be a nurse in a hospital. So you won't have a doctor, a farmer, and an artist. You will just have people who participate in socially necessary labor time as needed. In a capitalist society, skills are specialized and protected and squirreled away based on privilege of access and elitism often. In a communist society, that won't be the case. All skills will be shared. All skills will be accessible, and people can learn and develop as they want. I'm going to read a long Marx quote, so prepare yourself. For as soon as the distribution of labour comes into being, each person has a particular exclusive sphere of activity which is forced upon them and from which they cannot escape. They are a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critic, and must remain so if they do not want to lose their means of livelihood. He's talking about capitalism. While in a communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticise after dinner. Just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic.
First of all, I think it's really disingenuous that you set parameters for how people are allowed to answer your questions. If the answers have to contain "well, in capitalism," then implying that the answer would be invalid if it
did contain that phrase essentially means no one can answer your question honestly. You get to say, haha, see, and this looks like communists have nothing valid to say. It's a sneaky rhetorical device that people usually use when they're not interested in having a conversation. They just want to be right. No one is under any obligation to agree to that parameter, and it wouldn't invalidate their arguments if they didn't. But I'm going to assume that you do want to have this conversation and give you the benefit of the doubt. For the first question, I think what's important to remember is that communism isn't describing a government. It's not even really describing an economy. It's describing a social relationship. Work wouldn't exist in the same way as we understand it now. The production of life, i.e. the things humans need to be humans, would be indistinguishable from how humans exist, i.e. as living, loving, happy mammals. So the idea of getting up and going to work and having a job just wouldn't exist anymore. Global production would be based entirely on need, and that would happen in a way that was no more complicated than the way you and your friends work out what and how you're going to do the chores in your house. If there were genuinely people in that society that didn't want that and wanted a return to wage exploitation or wage labour, then society would have to work out how to deal with them. My vote would be by any means necessary, because there's no way that I would want to return to capitalism. For question 2, communists have been discussing this for 100 years. There are many, many answers out there. The one that I like the most is the one that shows how Mao and Stalin were historically and materially specific, and the result of the application of a theory of transition from capitalism to communism that just didn't work. If we want to avoid people like Mao and Stalin in the future, then the best thing to do is avoid the historical mistakes and material conditions that gave rise to them, and make sure that the working class organisations and structures that are created are genuine expressions of proletarian democracy. The third question is a complicated one, but one thing to point out is this idea that historical events can be determined by an individual human simply behaving differently is just nonsense. There is a simple truth here, though. The world we live on is being destroyed. The people that inhabit it are poor and destitute. Resources are finite, and the eternal growth of capitalism is just an illusion. If we want to avoid catastrophe, then call it communism or call it something else. But the proletarian class need to come together as a class and abolish capitalism. If we don't, then the history of human civilization will be a short one.
We're going to need police in our new society.
If your solution to a revolutionary problem is to immediately reach for structures inherent to capitalist society, and then you present those structures as instinctively obvious, you may want to consider what capitalist ideology is doing to you.
Why does that bother you? Every worker deserves respect, plain and simple.
One of the consequences of capitalist ideology bringing into existence the worker subject is that it makes people like this conflate a person's worth with their job. So when someone suggests that monotonous, mind-numbingly boring and exploitative jobs shouldn't be held up as some virtuous form of human activity, and instead opposed as the degrading reality of capitalist society, they automatically assume that I'm talking about the person and not the job, even though I very clearly was talking about the job. Capitalist ideology makes us view reality through the lens of capitalism, and so even liberals like this, who are trying to make a positive point, fall into the trap of defending the capitalist mode of production, whether they like it or not, by arguing that these jobs are somehow a good thing. Obviously, this user cherry-picked that one comment out of a dozen comments in which I explained my position and used it for the purposes of getting on his moral high horse. I don't understand what his motives are. He acknowledged that he'd misunderstood me and misrepresented me, but he's left the video up, so I don't know. If he had been more honest about it and had accounted for the rest of the comments, he would have shown that the point I was making was about the division of labour that capitalism has created and the world of disconnectedness and separation this has caused. Disconnected and separation from each other, but also disconnect and separation from the activity of producing our lives. Through the domination of commodity production and wage slavery and the pursuit of wealth accumulation, our activity has become entirely separated through the division of labour from pursuing the activity of just being alive and creating the things we need and want. Now, I'm advocating for a society in which living and producing life become the same thing, and in so doing, do not believe that we should patronize one another by elevating these backbreaking, monotonous, unnatural jobs as extolling some kind of virtue. What bothers me is that this vision of the world that this man advocates for is one where our activity is not our own, where we are compelled to work in order to survive, and the work that is available to most people is work that is repetitive, monotonous, and degrading, and is done in the service of creating wealth for others who, by virtue of this exploitative relationship, have created lives for themselves in which they enjoy abundance while people like us have very little. Now, in those comments, I am not seeking disrespect for anyone for any reason, but advocating for a world beyond the division of labour and wage slavery, where the working class have abolished capitalist social relations and produced a communist society, where our activity to produce our lives and living can become one thing. I just want to quote Karl Marx from his book Capital. Within the capitalist system, all methods for raising the social productiveness of labour are brought about at the cost of the individual labourer. All means for the development of production transform themselves into means of domination over and exploitation of the producers. They mutilate the labourer into a fragment of a man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work, and turn it into a hated toil. They estrange from him the intellectual potentialities of the labour process, in the same proportion as science is incorporated in it as an independent power. They distort the conditions under which he works, subject him during the labour process to a despotism the more hateful for its meanness. They transform his lifetime into a working time, and drag his wife and child beneath the wheels of the juggernaut of capital. Now, all I'm saying is I don't think we should respect jobs like that. It doesn't sound stupid at all. In fact, it's a really important question. The thing is, a commodity is not just any object that someone produces. A commodity is a specific kind of object that people produce to exchange specifically. People produce commodities to exchange them so that they can accumulate wealth. Commodities are usually exchanged for money. This is how the capitalist system works. Now, in capitalist society, commodity production and the exchange of commodities for wealth accumulation has really become the only form of economic activity humans participate in. In fact, it's imperative that commodities are produced and exchanged, because if they're not, wealth accumulation slows down and our economies tend to go into crisis. In this system, this horrid system, human beings don't use their labour to produce the things that they need or want in a sensible way. They're actually compelled to get a job in order to pay for commodities by producing the commodities, whether a good or service, so that they can be exchanged and so that somebody else, the capitalist, can accumulate wealth. In a communist society, commodity production is abolished. That whole system is destroyed. We no longer produce things in order to exchange them so we can accumulate wealth. This means our labour, as a form of human activity, is liberated and can now be used simply to produce the things society decides it needs and wants.
Without Stalin ever again.
The problem with Tristan's analysis is that it appears to misunderstand what a commodity is. He appears to be suggesting that any product created by labour is a commodity, but a commodity is actually a specific kind of thing, and I'm just going to quote from Marx here. He says, in order for a thing to possess commodity form, it must possess a twofold form, the form of a use value and the form of value. Now, the use value of a commodity is just the thing that it is, that it's used for. It's the tangible, natural form that it takes, whether that's a pencil or a coat or a lump of steel. Its value, however, is its social form, in which society validates a portion of labour as socially necessary, and then a quantum of value is determined. This value form is expressed through a commodity's relationship with other commodities, in which either a commodity expresses its value in another commodity, its relative form, or it serves as the material of the expression of value, its equivalent form. Now, this kind of commodity production and this social form of value is a unique social construct, and it only exists in a capitalist society. In the critique of the Gotha programme, it has to be understood that Marx is assuming that we are all talking about a society that is already communist. In the particular quotes that Tristan gave, Marx is talking about a society in which commodities do not exist. When Marx says that in this cooperative society producers do not exchange their products, he's not just saying this incidentally, it's really key to the whole understanding. He also goes on to say the products that labour produce no longer take the appearance of value, since in contrast to capitalist society, the labour that produces these products is no longer abstracted as value-producing labour, but is viewed simply as direct labour that produces useful things needed by society. So without these products being able to be exchanged, and without these products taking the form of value, these products of labour cannot be commodities. What causes confusion here is that Marx does talk about bourgeois right prevailing in the lower phase of communism, this bourgeois right being the principle that governs commodity exchange. And so I can see that that might cause confusion in those passages. But it is absolutely clear that he's only talking about the principle of commodity exchange. He's not talking about commodity exchange itself. Commodity exchange being two things exchanging for equivalent value. But in this case, in the society that he's talking about, it's not two commodities that are exchanging. It's the amount of labour expended by the individual producer that stands in relation to an equal average part of all of society's labour, which then takes the form of the means of consumption that you then access. This is a similar principle by which commodities are exchanged into capitalism, but it is not commodity exchange, which is an entirely different category. The passages in which Marx talks about average and not individual cases of exchange, he's not talking about commodity production or even really commodity exchange. He's making a comment about how in this principle of the exchange of equivalent, the individual producer would receive an average of social labour as a whole. In other words, for 1 hour of labour, you receive the means of consumption equivalent to an average hour of labour of the whole of society, not just the means of consumption produced by an individual labourer who laboured for an hour. So this means that you would be able to consume products that on average took 1 hour to produce rather than whatever an individual could produce in an hour. This could, Marx suggests, be indicated on labour vouchers. It should be noted though that labour vouchers didn't exist in the USSR. Money remained the universal equivalent, and it is for this reason that Stalin's ideological defence of commodity production is fundamentally confused, if not completely batshit insane. In the text Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, Stalin makes the argument that because commodity production is transhistorical, that means socialist commodity production can exist. But he goes on to say this, and I'm just going to quote from this book. Yes, value does exist and does operate. Wherever commodities and commodity production exist, there the value of labour must exist. Now, I don't disagree with that. We can agree on that. But the problem here is that while commodity production in some form or another might be transhistorical, abstract labour is not. Abstract labour is a category of the capitalist mode of production in which the division of labour prevails and the proletariat are compelled to sell their labour power to generate surplus. Value, which is the social validation of the portion of labour that was socially necessary to produce a commodity, in other words, it's abstract labour, is the bedrock upon which capitalist production and circulation is founded. If value does exist, as Stalin stated, so does abstract labour, the exploitation of labour, the accumulation of wealth, and therefore a capitalist mode of production. Stalin's solution to this is a very Stalin way of dealing with problems. In the same text he says this, and I'm quoting here, "I think that we must also discard certain other concepts taken from Marx's Capital, where Marx was concerned with an analysis of capitalism. I am referring to such concepts, among others, he doesn't specify, as necessary and surplus labour, necessary and surplus product, necessary and surplus time." Of course, this begs the question of why Marx would have bothered in the first place. If all he had to do for reality to be whatever he wanted was to simply ignore reality or delete words from books, he could have probably saved himself a lot of time. The division of labour is not a term that's indicating a neutral dividing of tasks that need to be accomplished in a society. The division of labour is a historical tendency that has been used by the capitalist mode of production, has become a key characteristic of the capitalist mode of production in order to make the extraction of surplus value and the valorisation of value more productive and more efficient. As capital has subsumed labour processes and brought them under the control of capital in the service of valorising value, it has divided these labour processes more and more and more, specialised them more and more and more, as it attempts to use technologies and different ways of organising production to extract all of that value and all of that wealth as much and as efficiently as possible. This means that the working classes have increasingly become separated from the tools and means that are required to reproduce themselves as living human beings. The working classes don't go to work to produce the things they need to reproduce themselves in a direct way. They are mediated through this division of labour by the wage. The abolition of the division of labour is a fundamental objective of Marx's vision of communism. Marx wanted to destroy this separation that exists between human beings being alive and human beings producing the things that they need to be alive. One way of sketching this out is thinking about it like a household. There are certain things that you have to do in your house in order to reproduce yourself there. You have to get up in the morning, you have to make your breakfast, you have to hoover, you have to do the dishes, you have to listen to the radio. But when you're doing these tasks, you're not a getter-upperer, you're not a breakfast maker, you're not a hooverer, you're not a pot washer, you're not a radio listener. These are just tasks that are otherwise inconsequential. They are just things that you do to reproduce yourself. This is the same vision that Marx had for communism, and I'll just read from the German ideology. For as soon as the distribution of labour comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in a communist society where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticise after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. Unfortunately, there's the Lassallean tendency that exists in contemporary socialist thought, and it's mostly, if not exclusively, legacy socialism that views the task of revolution, of class struggle, as taking control of those labour processes and reorganising their management, and in that sense it's viewed as a liberation of labour. But for Marx, it wasn't about liberating labour, it was about being liberated from labour. That's not to say that we won't have to do things. Of course, we'll have to do things. But the vision that Marx had of communism was that this separation between humans being alive and humans needing to reproduce themselves in order to be alive, this separation would be abolished and it would become the same thing. The sight of someone taking things off the shelf and running away with them without paying will be quite shocking to most people. But by performing this act, this person has broken with the logic of capitalism by treating products not as commodities but as simply products of consumption, and by doing so has acted unconsciously to overcome the separation between producers. In the capitalist mode of production, our society works like this. Our labour is divided and specialised, and we go to work to produce the things we need indirectly. We don't make our food, build our homes, or service our fuel needs by ourselves directly for the benefit of everybody. Producers, the people who make things, work independently and indirectly separated from each other, while at the same time being dependent on one another to produce those things that we need. Through the act of using your labour power to produce those things, you have provided products to society for you and for others. But because our society produces products not for need or use, but to produce more value, those products are taken out of your control, even though your labour produced them, and through a system of mediation are sold back to you so people who didn't make those products can make a profit. The act of going into a shop and taking things from the shelves is for most people an act of theft. But actually, if you think about it, in reality, it's an act of reclamation of products that workers' labour power has produced. And by reclaiming them, that system of mediation and that separation between producers starts to be bridged. Now, people will say, well, we can't just have people taking things from shelves. And you're right, under the capitalist mode of production, that just isn't going to work. The police, for example, are going to stop you. But in a society where things are produced and distributed based on need, where products are simply means of consumption and not commodities to produce value for other people, taking things from shelves will be exactly what you do. In other words, even though they might not realise it, the person in that video is an anti-capitalist hero.